in my mind, very delicate. It's something that requires thinking about things a little bit in a tight sort of a way. Things are happening forward, backwards. You're thinking about expectations. You're talking about backwards and forwards. I think in the case of fiscal policy, it's a little bit easy. Partly because data for fiscal policy is not always available on a very high frequency. Okay. So the idea that we had for monetary policy, we wanted to ask the question: when is monetary policy supportive? When is monetary policy not supportive? Is it supportive at the right time? Is it not supportive at the right time? Is it making a mistake or is it doing the right thing? We want to ask the same kind of question for fiscal policy. Is fiscal policy doing the right thing at the right time? So we're going to first look at fiscal policy overall, then we're going to look at fiscal indicators, and in particular, we are going to ask the question of how can we calculate a cyclically adjusted fiscal balance? Okay. And the reason for that is that just in terms of intuition, when the economy is booming, there is a lot of activity. If there's a lot of activity, there are a lot of income. If there's a lot of income, a lot of taxes can be collected. And the reason why a lot of taxes are collecting is because the economy is doing so great and it's overheating. So if the economy is overheating, but it should not overheat, then what would the tax collection have been if the economy was not overheated? Comparing the tax collection when the economy is overheating to tax collections when the economy is in a recession, it's not like the government has made a mistake, just the economy happens to be up and down. How do we take out the impact of the business cycle from the fiscal accounts and ask the question, what would tax collections be if the economy had been performing at full potential? So we take out the fault of the government because demand goes down, but we don't want to blame the government for the economy being overheated or not doing too well. So we want to calculate, and since we are talking about the business cycle, we want to make an adjustment for the cycle, adjust the fiscal numbers for the cycle, and then calculate the fiscal deficit. And we know that government spending is something that helps the economy, government reductions in taxes helps the economy, so we want to make those adjustments. And after we make those adjustments, we want to measure the stance of fiscal policy. Is fiscal policy supporting the economy, or is it taking something out of the economy? And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about the macroeconomic effects of fiscal policy, but that is something that you are familiar with. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the fiscal accounts and look at what are the different kind of fiscal indicators that we can construct to assess the fiscal stance. We will define and calculate what is called the cyclically adjusted fiscal balance, and another measure that's used to assess where the fiscal policy is what is called the structural balance. We will define two things: the fiscal stance, which is quite simple, and the fiscal impulse. The impulse means how much is being pushed in and how much is being taken out. What is the change in the amount that's being pushed in and pushed out? And then we ask the question whether fiscal policy is appropriate. When the economy is not doing so well, more should be pushed into the economy, or less should be taken out of the economy, and the other way around as well. We will talk about the fiscal multiplier, which is something that takes you back to the first course in macroeconomics, okay? The Keynesian fiscal multiplier, and the factors that affect its size and sum. So let's first look at fiscal policy. We know that the economy affects what is happening in terms of the fiscal budget, because we know in terms of the four sector framework, there are relationships between the real sector and the fiscal sector. So, and at the same time, what is done in terms of government spending and taxes affects the economy. If the government spends more, it adds to aggregate demand, leads to higher output. If the government taxes more, it reduces disposable income, and if disposable income is less, you will get less consumption and less output. We are not going to talk about the issue of fiscal sustainability, but we're going to talk about mostly how fiscal policy affects demand in the short term, because we're talking about short-term macroeconomic stabilization. So, in the short term, the purpose of fiscal policy is to provide a stimulus to the economy, okay, so that the size of the business cycle or the ups and downs in the economy can be moderated. In the long run, fiscal policy has other functions to provide sustained growth, well-being, macro stability, low inflation. But in the short term, the purpose of fiscal policy is to provide macroeconomic stability in terms of output. That's what we can. What are the constraints on fiscal policy? Well, absorptive capacity. If the government wants to build a lot of roads all at one time, does it have enough free labor? Does it have enough resources to do? Can the economy absorb so much investment at one time? There are revenue constraints. If the government wants to spend too much, it has to raise a lot of taxes. At any given point of time, the government cannot keep increasing the tax rate, because that will have a negative impact on economic activity and incentives in the economy. At any point of time, the government cannot become very, very strict with people, collect more and more taxes, because that can lead to problems. People can become unhappy. Over time, slowly, those efforts can be increased so that the collection from people can improve, so people who are not paying taxes can also start paying taxes. In addition, there are macroeconomic constraints. Okay? If the economy is overheating, the government should not and cannot spend much more. If the government spends a lot, then if there are a lot of pressures in the labor market, if the government is spending a lot of people are getting absorbed on construction projects. The labor market tightens. If the labor market tightens, then there is a demand for higher wages. If there's a demand for higher wages, the prices have to be increased. So government spending can also contribute to inflationary pressures. If the government spends a lot, some of that spending has to be done on imports. And if there are more imports, the current account surplus is going to either decline or there's going to be current account deficit. That can cause other kinds of problems. The government also may have limits on how much it can finance. And if it finances a very large budget deficit, it has to either take resources from the banking system, which means that less is available for the private sector to borrow, or if the government finances the deficit from outside, it would lead to an increase in external debt, which can cause problems going forward. And if the government has a very large amount of external debt, for example, if there are shocks in the international capital markets and interest rates go up, then debt service on interest payments of the external debt can become very large, and this happens to a number of economies. then the government can run into problems as well. So fiscal analysis, the key questions that we want to ask is, what is the fiscal position and how it has changed? Is fiscal policy expansionary or contractionary? And once we can define the fiscal stance, whether it is appropriate, we want the fiscal stance to be counter-cyclical. We do not want the fiscal stance to be pro-cyclical. Counter-cyclical means that when the economy is heating up, fiscal policy should slow down the economy. If the economy is slowing down, fiscal policy should be expansionary to moderate the cycle. We'll not ask this question about sustainability as part of this course. Maybe next year the students will see some of that, but not for you. What is the definition of the public sector? Well, maybe this is something that we did in the first day as well. The public sector is a very broad concept, okay, which includes the government and the public corporations. What would be an example of a non-financial public corporation? Vietnam Airlines. What would be an example of a financial public corporation? Agribank. It's a bank, it's a financial, it's owned by the government, that would be here. The central government, basically in Hanoi. Central government in Hanoi. State governments would basically be provinces, Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, and then there are local governments. Yeah, Bangkok, right. Local governments. Okay. So, if we just look at the general government and consolidate it with the non-financial public operations, we get a measure of the public sector. But if we then consolidate it with other public financial corporations, we get a full picture of the public sector. In the case of Vietnam, we do not have this kind of a consolidation. Even the general government data is somewhat hard to get. Very little information is published to the Ministry of Finance. In the case of some of the other countries that you might be working on, you might be able to get a lot more data. But for the purposes of our course and the analysis, we'll be using very simple data. We don't need very complicated. Okay. So what do the fiscal accounts of a country look like? The fiscal accounts of a country are prepared according to international standards, and if they're prepared according to international standards, earlier they used to look like this, where of course you have revenues, then the spending of the government was called expenditure, broken down into current spending and capital spending, which is basically spending on infrastructure, buildings, and so on and so forth, and was broken down into interest payments and non-interest payments. The non-interest payments were basically called primary spending, and then the difference between those two things was, and then there was another item which was called net lending, which used to be, if the government got something from outside in terms of grants, it could on-lend it to other government agencies, and that was a part of government spending. The difference between the revenues and all of this other things was the overall balance, which is, and if there's a deficit here, it has to be financed. If the overall balance is positive, there's a surplus, the government can reduce its debt. If there is a deficit, the government has to finance. It can either finance by borrowing outside the country or borrowing inside the country, either from commercial banks or in the stock exchange. It could also finance it by selling some assets. Let's say the government owns a very large building. Okay, so this very nice big building around the Hikari complex with that thing, now it's empty. It's going to be sold to somebody, it's going to get a revenue, and if that had happened, that would have shown up here. It is a way of financing expenditure. Then in 2014, a little bit later, the categories were changed a little bit. Okay, you still had revenues, but expenditure was called expense. Once again, primary, non-interest and interest payments. There was a new concept introduced, which is the operating balance, which is the revenues minus what used to be current expenditures before. So we had one measure of the deficit. If the government builds a road or builds a building, an office building, it is acquiring an asset. It is a non-financial asset because it's a physical real asset. So that part looks like capital spending. So you can think of this acquisition of non-financial asset essentially as capital spending. If the government sells a building, right, then it is giving up an asset and you net it out. So instead of doing, so all of this, so this used to be gross, and some netting used to be done here, that's not done anymore. And this is essentially capital spending, net capital spending. And the sum of expense and net acquisition of non-financial assets is expenditure. And then that has, if there's a deficit, it has to be financed by borrowing. Okay. And then this part here, which looks like a very fancy sort of term, acquisition of financial assets, net incurrence of liability, is essentially finance. So the simple way to think about government is that it has to collect revenues, it has to spend on current payments. Current payments are things like the wages of civil servants. The government has to buy goods and services to carry on government operations. That's all in here. The government has to build roads and buildings for its operations. That is supposed to be here. So if you look at the staff report of the IMF or other international organizations, you will see a table like this. And in the case of the US also, if you could go to the IMF, you would probably see a staff report that looks like this, in which the top part is the revenue side, where the revenues are broken down into different categories of revenues. For the exercise that you're going to do in presentation, you will not need so much detail. But just to understand where all this is coming from. Then there's an expenditure side. After the expenditures are taken out of the revenues, you get a deficit. And here everything is being expressed as a percentage of GDP. And after, if there's a deficit, it has to be financed. Okay. And then all of these things are some additional pieces of information. So from there, what can we construct as indicators of the fiscal position? The first thing is, of course, the overall balance. Total revenues minus total expenditures is the overall balance. Remember, we said that current expenditures have two components: interest expenditures and non-interest expenditures. If we just take revenues and subtract from that the non-interest current expenditures and the capital spending, we get what is called the primary balance. So what are we doing? So if we take revenues minus only this part of current spending and take that out, then we would get not the overall balance, but the primary balance. Or in other words, we take the overall balance and add back interest payments, we would get the primary balance. We'll do some of those calculations. So this is now. We can also construct a measure of current balance, which is current revenues minus current expenditures. And in this current expenditures, we include both the non-interest expenditures and the interest expenditures. We can clearly calculate the debt to GDP ratio. We can also calculate what is the total amount of financing that the government needs to continue its operations. And all of these different measures give us a different sense of what the fiscal position of what the government budget is doing. The overall balance gives us a sense of what is being added or taken out of aggregate demand. The primary balance, because we've taken out the interest payments. The interest payments are related to the debt from last year. It is not related to the current operations of the government. And that gives us a sense of the debt burden of the economy. The current balance is the government savings. Right? What is getting in this year, what is spending this year, in terms of the current spending. The capital expenditure is something that are related to expenditures that give returns over a longer period of time. So if we take out only the current expenditure, current revenue, we get a measure of government savings and taking out the capital spending. The debt to GDP ratio gives an idea of whether the fiscal operations of the government as they are sustainable over a long period of time. So on and so on. Why do the government operations change? There are some measures that the government can take actively, which are called discretionary fiscal policy. And what are those things that the government can change? It can change the amount of spending. It can change the tax rate. The government can decide that it wants to have lesser number of provinces in Vietnam. If there are lesser number of provinces in Vietnam, the number of civil servants in the country is less, right? And that leads to a reduction in government expenditures. If the government decides that it wants to change the VAT rate from 10% to 12%, that is a discretionary change on the part of the government. There are some things that the government cannot change actively, but are related to where the economy is. If the government does not change the tax rate, but the economy booms, then with the same tax rate, tax collections are higher. If tax collections are higher because the economy is booming, there is an automatic brake on disposable income. That automatic brake on disposable income that reduces aggregate demand without the government having done anything. So in that sense, it is automatic. It's automatic stabilizer in the sense that the economy is overheating. There is something in the system which leads to taxes increasing and the economy automatically being cooled down a little bit. At the same time, in many industrial countries, almost all industrial countries, if the economy is going through a recession, it means that employment is less. If employment is less, unemployment is higher. If unemployment is higher because there's a social safety system, people stand in line and say, I'm unemployed, I would like to be given some assistance. If they receive that assistance, disposable income becomes higher automatically without the government doing anything because more people are coming forward to receive that assistance. It is again automatic, it is built into the system, and it's stabilizing the system in the sense that when the economy is down, more people will get that assistance and that will help increase aggregate demand. There are other things that can be happening beyond the business cycle that may be related to things like commodity prices. So a country like Chile, for example, which is a big exporter of copper, if the price of copper goes down, then earnings from copper and the taxation of copper will go down. Mongolia is again a country that produces a lot of gold and copper, and commodity prices in the world economy keep going up and down. So even though the government has not really done anything by itself internally, its revenues go down. So there are other things beyond the business cycle. So the government is not doing anything, but there are these external shocks which have an impact on the budget. These are not related to the business cycle. These are sort of like global shocks that are happening outside the economy that affect the. There might be other. Well, let's just stop. So the fiscal balance, the simple fiscal balance, revenues minus expenditures, can provide a misleading signal of what the fiscal budget is doing, because the government has no control over prices outside of the country. It is not actively doing anything here, it's just that revenues and expenditures are falling depending on what the business cycle is. What we are really interested in is finding out what is it that the government is actively doing. If we take out the effect of these factors, because this is something outside the control of the government, we want to basically say, what is it that the government actively doing which is helping or hurting the economy in terms of its impact in aggregate. So a large fiscal deficit does not always mean that there is a fiscal expansion. And a large surplus does not always mean that fiscal policy is being acted. Think of the case of commodity prices going up. Let's say the case of Mongolia. The revenues from copper have gone up. The government doesn't change its spending, it starts running a fiscal surplus. But that is not due to anything that the government has done, it's just the impact of these global commodity prices that's showing up in the form of fiscal surplus. So we want to take the impact of these things out of an analysis of what actually we think the government is doing to support the economy or to take aggregate demand out of it. So in terms of the adjustments, what are the various steps that we need to take? We can take out, first of all, things that will happen only once. If we have information that in a particular year, the government sold, let's say, this building, close to the old government building is sold, it looks like the government has a huge surplus, but we need to take it out, right? It's just, the government can't sell that building again and again and again. It can be sold only once. So we take out the one-off things, right? Then if there are, once we've taken care of them, then we move to the cyclical adjustments. And where we adjust the revenues and the expenditures to ask the question, if the economy were producing at full employment, what would revenues be? It is sort of the same kind of a question as a little bit in monetary policy. What would be not quite, let me keep it separate. Here we basically want to take out the impact of the cycle on the budget. And once we've taken the impact of the cycle on the budget, we also can do a correction for these kinds of commodity prices. In the case of Vietnam, we're not going to do this. There is not a whole lot of that. We're just going to do something very simple. We're going to adjust it for the business cycle. And we can adjust it for the business cycle. Why? Because we have a measure of the potential output that we've calculated. That's the only adjustment. In addition, it is possible to do that adjustment either on an aggregated basis, which means that you take total revenues and adjust it for the cycle, or you can take revenue by revenue, VAT revenue, personal income tax revenue, or corporate income tax revenue, category by category, and do a disaggregated adjustment, we are going to do this in our spreadsheets and in the analysis. But it's good to know that these things can be done in a lot of different ways, and in many countries the assessment of fiscal policy again is quite complicated. We are doing a very simple 101 version of assessment of fiscal policy. So one-off adjustments, sale of the big government building, telecom licenses, because the licenses cannot be sold again and again, capital transfers, privatization receipts, the big government building being sold once, you take them off out of the fiscal balance. How do we do a cyclically adjusted balance? How do we adjust revenues to the cycle? If this is the amount of revenues collected, then if potential output is higher than actual output, we can adjust these revenues by the ratio of the potential output to actual output and calculate a cyclically adjusted revenues where the adjustment includes an elasticity parameter. So R is actual revenues, output is Y, potential output is Y star, and epsilon is the elasticity of revenues if, and commonly the value that's used is 1. So in effect, we are calculating the cyclically adjusted revenues as the actual revenues multiplied by the ratio of potential output to actual output. Think about what will happen just in terms of a simple idea. So the cyclically adjusted revenues is the actual revenues if Y star is greater than Y, is the economy in a recession or a boom?
Sorry, recession.
If Y star is less than Y, the economy is in a boom. So think of it this way, this implies that Y star divided by Y is greater than 1. This implies that Y star divided by Y is less than 1. When the economy is in a recession, you will make that adjustment upwards. Why? Because the economy is in a recession, it's not collecting as much revenues as it could collect if it were operating at full employment. So that adjustment sounds like the right adjustment to make. If the economy is in a boom, you take the actual revenues and adjust them down because the economy is collecting more revenues than it would be collecting if it were not in the boom. So that adjustment makes sense. And similarly, we can make this adjustment for government expenditures, adjust them upward or down depending upon whether the economy is and in the case of so the elasticity, if epsilon is less than 0 is counter-cyclical, but typically the value that's used is 0. In the case of Vietnam, there might not be a whole lot of automatic stabilizers. There isn't a very strong social safety net. There might be some transfers that go up if the economy is down, the government provides a little more support. I think in the files, we basically do not make much adjustment on the expenditure side. Okay. The economy is in a boom, Y is greater than Y star. These things happen, and the actual balance is greater than the cyclically adjusted balance. In the case of a recession, once you do all of these calculations, you will find that the cyclically adjusted balance is greater than the actual balance, actual fiscal deficit or actual balance. As an example, if revenues are 1,000, expenditures is 900, GDP is 4,000, and potential output is 3,900, which means that the economy is in a boom. Output is more than potential output. Let me forget about doing these. We can do it in this. So based on this, you can find the adjusted revenues by taking them multiplied by the ratio of Y star to Y. You can calculate adjusted expenditures, and here what will be the overall balance? This number will be how much? Revenues are higher than expenditures, so the overall balance will be a positive number. There will be a surplus of 100 here. If you calculate the overall balance as a percentage of GDP, that number will be 100 divided by 4,000. 100 divided by 4,000 is whatever that number is. And here, if you make the adjustment, what will we do? We'll take the 4,000 multiplied by 3,900 divided by 4,000. So the revenue will be more or less than 1,000. It will be less than. So this number will become smaller. This number, we are saying we're not going to make any adjustment. This number will be the same, 900. If this number is smaller than 1,000, this number will be what? It will be a smaller surplus. Okay. Or it might be a deficit, I don't know. Let's actually do the calculation. So in that case, we have revenues is 1,000, expenditures is 900. So the overall balance is equal to 100. GDP is 4,000. Right? Okay. So if potential output is 3,900. What will be the cyclically adjusted revenues? So adjusted revenue, cyclically adjusted will be 1,000 multiplied by 3,900 divided by 4,000. The expenditures, cyclically adjusted, they're saying they're not changing. So what will this number be? The cyclically adjusted balance will be how much? Is somebody giving me a number? 75, is it? Right? So it's a smaller number as a percentage. Well, a second thing that you want to remember is that once you do this calculation, here the deficit as a percentage of GDP, so we have Y star is equal to 3900. So the surplus as a percentage of GDP is 100 divided by 4,000 multiplied by 100. But when you calculate the cyclically adjusted balance as a percentage of something, you have to calculate it as a percentage of Y star. So this number here will be the surplus cyclically adjusted has to be 75 divided by 3900 multiplied by 100. So during the boom, the fiscal situation looks better than it actually is because the economy is booming. In a recession, the fiscal situation looks worse than it is because of the recession and because of the revenues being too low. We're not making any adjustment to the expenditures. So we can use this example to actually calculate the cyclically adjusted balance. Yeah. So when you calculate the cyclically adjusted balance, you want to calculate it as a percentage of potential output. Here the overall balance is calculated as a percentage of not the potential but the actual output. So in that case, we're doing a cyclical adjustment based on aggregated numbers, but we know that revenues consist of different categories. We also know that expenditures consist of different categories. In some countries, when data is available, you want to make an adjustment to each of these categories separately, right? And use different elasticities. So here, you would calculate each of these individual categories of revenue on a cyclically adjusted basis using, let's say, different elasticities for different categories of revenue. Personal income tax might have a different elasticity. When the economy is booming, the increase in personal income taxes might be very different from the increase in corporate income taxes. Might be very different from the increase in the VAT. So because there are differences across different categories of revenues, the increase or the decrease in the revenues with the cycle might be very different. And if that is the case, you want to make different kinds of adjustments. Okay? And on disaggregated basis, and similarly for there might be other categories of revenues and expenditures which do not depend on the cycle at all. So you take them separate, and the ones that depend on the cycle, you will make an adjustment and calculate a cyclically adjusted balance, and then calculate it as a percentage GDP. So you use different elasticities for different categories of revenues. don't worry about this. This is more complicated. We're not going to use, but the idea is that the basic idea is that you're trying to remove the impact of the business cycle from the operations of the budget. We need to do it separately for the revenue side. We need to do it separately for the expenditure side. We can either do it for aggregated revenues and expenditures, or if we have more information, we can do it for individual categories of revenues and individual categories of expenditures. What kind of expenditure categories, if we're looking at the disaggregate approach, would most likely be affected by the cycle? Well, unemployment benefits is definitely one that is affected by the cycle. The government salaries don't depend on the cycle. Whether the economy is booming or coming down, the civil servant salaries, they don't go up when there's a boom. They are related to different kinds of cases. What elasticists use? Again, the elastic overall expenditure output gap and other cycle. In the case of the disaggregated approach, you would use different elasticities for different tax bases or different kinds of taxes. Where do we get these elasticities from? People have used different kinds of regression frameworks, maybe across countries, to estimate these elasticities. If we don't have the elasticities for a particular country, we can use the elasticities that are created from other similar countries. What are the kind of numbers, for example, that are used across countries? The first thing to notice from this table, as I said, is that the elasticity can be quite different across different kinds of taxes. And the elasticities across different kinds of expenditure categories can be different as well. So an aggregative approach may give you a different answer compared to a disaggregated approach. So this is basically a picture where we're saying that if we have a business cycle, we're adjusting the revenues and the expenditures. In the case of expenditures, let's say we don't do any adjustment, so there should be no adjustment to expenditures. But the revenues will be adjusted because we are assuming, and if the elasticity is greater than 1, then the adjustment to the revenues is greater than the ups and downs in the business cycle. So if this is the business cycle, and if the elasticity that we're using to make the adjustment is greater than 1, then the adjustment to revenues will be larger than the frequency of the business cycle. This is a picture on what cyclically adjusted balances look like across a range of countries. And finally, after we made all of these adjustments for the business cycle, as I said to you, in some countries we might need to adjust for commodity prices, for other kinds of events in the economy, but this is something that we're not going to do here. Just to keep in mind that if you're working on an economy that is a very large commodity exporter, you would like to make these kinds of adjustments, especially for commodity prices, to see what is the impact of the budget on the economy. Let me stop for about 5 or 7 minutes. You're also tired of listening to me. I need a sip of water. I'll be back. I know.